Well, thank you very much, and thank you for all the panelists. We had a short chat amongst ourselves just before we started this session. So the session is transforming education, how EdTech might transform education. And the chat we were having was, we listened to a lot of views today that certainly talked about the problems and the challenges and how people haven't scaled or education doesn't, do enough. But I think generally this panel has decided to be a rebel because we all firmly believe that this is a great sector to be in. All sorts of interesting things that are happening, will happen. But if we're stupid enough to just say technology will solve everything, nothing will happen at all. Second, challenges exist in every sector, and you just take them as your working parameters and deal with them as you would. The sun rises in the east, it rises in the east. What are you going to do about it? You just adjust for that and go from there. So there's regulation, there's issues, but we're sitting in a massive market. And more interestingly, if you're on the tech side and the tech-enabled delivery side, your market is a global market. It's not just India. It's not just India, Africa, Kenya. It's India, US, anywhere else on the planet. All it needs is a little imagination. It just needs a thoughtful process. We heard that from NIIT as well. And I think you'll hear it from all of the folks here. We have a very nice panel that brings all sorts of views. Prachi and I are the sort of losers in this. We're the investors. We sit here saying, how will you scale and do whatever? We just ask the questions. But Parth, of course, looks at real impact, policy, and what's going on in the world and will help us have that view. Karthik, of course, is making things happen. He's taking degree programs online. He's delivering despite enormous amounts of regulation. He says it's not a problem at all. So we want to hear from him a lot. And Avnita is the person everybody in the audience wants to talk to because she's Podar's buyer. She's deployed all sorts of technology and has had experience figuring out what to do with it and what the real challenges are that have to get sorted out as schools look to absorb technology. So that's the sort of format we're going to start in. I'll forget about throwing out some numbers, but maybe it's worthwhile to throw out some numbers. We all talked about, everybody put up that big slide about how big the space is and how many people are in it. Here's some numbers. There's 1.4 million schools in this country, is what somebody told me. By the way, let me take a quick poll of hands. How many EdTech or technology-enabled delivery companies are here? Can I see a show of hands? Large numbers of you. How many of you are delivering in a local language? One, two, just a handful. And how many of you are attacking anything beyond, truly the tier 1 and tier 2 cities? So almost nobody. So here's the problem. There are 1.4 million schools in this country. Of that, 300,000 are private schools. The rest are government schools. Of the 300,000, only 80,000 are English medium. Of that 80,000, only 18,000 have a CBSE-like curriculum. They may not even be CBSE schools. And if you intersect that with tier 1 and tier 2 cities, that number drops radically. So most of you are attacking only that tiny little segment of the market, while the real market is out there. And that market is accessible only through newer technologies or doing something drastic. It's something worth thinking about. If we keep going at this little portion and keep trying to attack it all together, and I'll make an unfortunately blunt statement. We had 5 companies up on stage. 2 of them are in test prep, 2 of them are tuition. Another one is, another couple doing knockoffs of social learning to a degree. Only one had something interesting to show us. Unfortunately, when we look at business plans come at us, we see the same thing. So we'd love to see new imaginative ideas that mix technology, delivery, business models. If you keep trying to sell to schools, if I was in a multinational, we sold to India, the first thing we heard was India pricing. And if you ever sold to the education sector anywhere in the world, you will hear about education pricing. And when you intersect India pricing with education pricing, you end up with very tiny numbers that take a very long time to sell. So if you're trying to sell to schools, you're already doing something wrong. In my personal opinion, schools are a B2B2C play. It's like pharmaceutical companies selling to doctors. Doctors are the buyers. The pharma companies convince them to prescribe the medicine the patient pays. Schools behave the same way typically. Fees are passed on to parents. If the parents don't pay, the school doesn't pony up. Let's be real. So we think that you have to carefully look at your business models. You have to look at who pays. I would recommend looking at what Clever.com did in the US. 40,000 schools, not a single one of them pays Clever.com. They make a lot of money. They make money from the other end of the chain. We think that there's lots of ways to attack this problem, but why don't we get started? Parth, if you can sort of give us a sense of the regulatory framework, what you see going on, and the impact that's having, good, bad, positive, negative.
Thanks, Gaurav. Just sort of one addition to your numbers. You said there are 300,000 private schools in India. I would actually double that number if you add unrecognized schools in that list. So 300,000 are recognized schools, but there are as many, and actually more, are unrecognized private schools, which we refer to as budget private schools, so low fee, low cost private schools, which are actually the largest growing segment in the Indian school education system. Right. So one addition to those numbers. Let me start with a question. Think about this. Is Uber was an Indian startup? If Uber was an Indian startup, would it have survived the problems that the Uber faced in India in the first 2 or 3 years of its operations? Right? My guess is that they would not have survived. Not only the company would not have survived, but I probably would venture to say that the owners of the company would have probably be sitting in the jail along with the driver who is currently there. Right? So Uber survived only because of the fact that they have deep pockets, they're international players, and have the kind of influence they can bring to bear on the state governments and the national government, right? And that tells you something about the policy environment in which the tech companies operate, right? So my sort of one proposition today is that the research and advocacy of groups like ours, the think tanks which are doing policy work, is focused largely on the systemic issues. How do we improve learning outcomes in the schools? How do we make sure the teachers are properly prepped? They're exposed to technology that they are going to be using in the classroom, right? So there are larger systemic issues, which are obviously very important. And our focus has largely been there. If you read the book, recent book by Nandan and Viral, Rebooting India, you get excited about the possibilities of disruptive technological changes, right? But one footnote there in the book is about the policy challenges that these companies are likely to face, right? And these are the challenges which are different from one that we focus on generally, either as think tanks or as academic communities, where we are looking at systemic issues, but we now need to look at specific technologies and even products. When they come on the market, what would it take for them to get off the ground, get us a pilot program running, and second, if the pilot is successful, what policy changes would be required to have them go to scale, right? So introduction as well as scaling of new tech it requires thinking about policies, environment in which they are going to be operating, right? So for example, Nandan, and this came up in our discussion with him, has a great new product called XStep. I hope many of you probably heard of that. If the program works, which is going to democratize sort of access to quality education in the country, at its sort of peak, it could actually provide you a completely alternative way of education for K-12, right? Where you can bypass the existing system altogether and get your 12th standard certificate from one of the boards, right? Now, to make that model work, there are going to be a series of challenges, right? And many of them are going to be regulatory policy challenges, right? Those are not going to be big policies, small policies, but at the same time going to be very important for that model to be introduced and to be able to scale and have the impact that they want to have. So my sort of proposition from panel is the fact that not only the policy groups like ours, but also the investors and the tech entrepreneurs should start thinking about the policy environment within which they are going to operate and think upfront, unlike what Uber was able to do, many of us would not be able to do that. Think upfront about how to deal with those challenges, how to make them work in your favor and not against you.
Let me just comment slightly on that. So I think your point of saying work within, understand the framework and work within it, but at the same time, Uber is facing litigation pretty every city it went to across the world. So let's not talk about just Indian regulation. Napster was shut down when it started. because the entire music industry went after it. But those are the things that eventually changed what happened. People understood what was doable, what was not doable, where they would come up against stuff and did something different. I also want to make one other point. There is no reason a Khan Academy couldn't have started from India. There is no reason Hot Chalk couldn't have been run out of India. In fact, should have been run out of India given our BPO basis and our backgrounds and deep content development capabilities out of India. And there's no reason why we only have to be limited to this market. So I'll just make that point. I'm going to, it's actually a nice segue to you, but let's stay with the program. So Prachi, if you want to talk about government again, your experience with impact and government models that you've seen, as well as the impact companies that you're working with.
Sure. Thanks, Gaurav. And I would like to begin by thanking VCCircle for making the affordable education agenda mainstream. And Gaurav actually set it up very well because, as a mainstream commercial PE investor, the numbers he threw out in front of us very much tell us that if there is business to be had, if there's scale to be had, if there's money to be made, it's actually in the area of affordable sector. So it's not just something for the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, which does it for, as a cause that we are working for, but it really makes commercial sense. It actually makes business sense. So, it was good today to see many of our investees, people like iStar and LaborNet come and speak over here and sharing their experiences in terms of creating responsible social enterprises, which are actually doing great business as well. On the topic of government, I would like to just, because there's been a lot of discussion around working with the government and challenges of working with the government. I wanted to show the positive side of, how you could work with the government and why the government will work with entrepreneurs like you, right? Government schools, and there are huge numbers of government schools, are facing an existential threat today, right? Because the quality in these schools is very poor. It's very obvious and it's very public now that the quality in these schools are poor. And so therefore there is a big demand for quality, for improvement in learning outcomes from government schools. And so therefore, from how we viewed the government in the past, it's changing now recently. There's more and more demand. As Garima from BCG was talking this morning, there have been, in Haryana, they've actually looked at the private sector largely to come and change a lot of things and done that on a completely commercial basis, not looking for pro bono support, but actually have floated tenders, gotten companies, and some of them are, small companies as well. But how does one work with the government? So at least we as investors look at, government revenue as a revenue line in the business plan very positively, but there is a way to hedge that risk and there is a way to work with the government. 2 or 3 things which I think work very well in working with the government. One is that the product has to be very curricular. It has to meet a demand of the government and not something which is good to have and is at a different stage of evolution, like I sometimes see in government products, in EdTech products. So I think that's one core requirement of the government. They're looking more and more for improving their quality and therefore are looking for products which are tightly tied with what they are doing currently. That's one. The other is, I think, as smaller companies and newer companies, or even as big companies, it's beneficial to go work with the government, which is, one large entity to work with, in more of a consortium-led approach, where you had, and a carefully created consortium, where there were other trusted entities with the government itself, and not just, you as a private sector or as a private company going and working with the government. And the third, which cuts across anything, whether it's government or it's private schools, I think the product eventually has to have impact. I mean, the reason they're looking to the private sector is because they want to improve quality of schools, and therefore you need to demonstrate measurable impact on children's learning outcomes to be able to not just sell one time but keep selling. And I think that's where the private sector has really lacked when it has tried to work with the government. But that said, on the larger topic of EdTech and why some of these things are not scaling and what we are learning from our companies on how they could scale, I would just put out 3 learnings that we've had from entrepreneurs like you who we've worked with. One is, I think it's very important to understand, and Avnita will talk a lot more about it, that there is very little take-up for products in schools. You need a wraparound service around your products. The human capital, our teachers, they're just not ready to lap up technology products. And that's what a lot of entrepreneurs are shying away from. If they're not shying away from, they're not actually adequately building the cost associated with providing a service around training, a service around adoption in the schools. So just product products are not enough. You know, if you're looking at K-12 market, if you're looking to sell through schools, you need to be mindful about what is the service around your product and how will you drive adoption. That's number one. The second is, when we talk on challenges, one of the biggest challenge which remains is, of course, the scale up of your sales teams as the product scale, right? Which remains to be a challenge because, you know, it's a highly fragmented market. There are 600,000 schools, but there are 600,000 separate schools. Literally selling to the first 100 schools is just as hard as selling to the next 100 and then to the 1,000. So we have to think of ways in how this starts becoming a pull product, and, you know, what's the role that parents play over here. There's a huge parent activism of sorts, wanting to get better education for their children, all the way from the poorest parents to the most well-off parents. So how are we engaging as companies, and are we actually building it again in our sales and marketing efforts? What we'll need to do for the parents, how will they be the ones who'll rile up behind the schools, who'll rile up behind the products and understand the value that you guys are bringing with their products to the schools. So one is, you know, think services also and not just product, build adequately for tapping into the parents as a stakeholder, because they're a critical stakeholder. They are the ones who are paying for all the services, whether it's the check comes through schools or whether the check comes directly. The third is a very, you know, long list, which I think you must have heard or learned with your own experience. But it's a fact that, you know, when you're trying to sell to schools, we are still looking for curricular products. We're still looking for products which get tightly integrated with what is being taught in schools. We are not looking to replace the teachers. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. So, you know, you can't have very threatening products which are threatening to replace the teachers. And I think that's something which, you know, you need to be mindful of in terms of, you know, positioning your products to the schools. There has to be a clear economic rationale for buying a product, which is again something in education we forget, because, you know, education seems to be a good to do thing. So we don't think when we go and make a pitch, you know, you need to convince the school why they should buy and what do they gain economically after buying your product, right? So one of our investee companies has a very clear value proposition that, you know, their product actually saves them that much time, you know, which is equivalent of 2 teachers' time. And so therefore, you know, they can think of rationalizing it economically in some sense. So there has to be a clear economic rationales, and I cannot emphasize and re-emphasize that impact has to be the core component of what you're doing, and it has to come fast, it has to come in a measurable fashion.
Thanks, Prachi. Let me also just quickly comment. Earlier in one of the panels, somebody had asked the question, would you be looking at tech-enabled businesses as an investor? Both Prachi and I would point out that we think of, when you look at education, everybody said it's a different beast. It must have a blend of things. Therefore, both of us do invest in brick and mortar chains, because the problem in India is access and quality. And anybody that can increase quality access, whether through chains of quality schools, is certainly worth investing in. If they can tech enable it to reach even more, if they can extend the reach of teachers, these are some of the problems that you can certainly solve, and we're happy to look at those models as private equity or as impact investors. The generalist e-commerce investors obviously have other financial imperatives to look at. Let me switch gears now. Avnita, we're going to switch to you to talk about the K-12 sector and change management as an integral part of changing education.
Good afternoon. I think I'm the only educator in this room. And I was just thinking, why is this so quiet and, there's not so much energy, and I realize that there are teachers and educators and principals missing in this hall. Well, as a practitioner, I would say that all is not so gloomy. I mean, education is waiting for innovation. As practitioners, we are looking for disruptive changes, and we're looking for investment. So, when you initially said that investors are not really interested in investing in education, I was a little, despondent, but that having qualified that you're looking at investing in access and quality, and I think that is something which is very encouraging. First of all, I'd begin by saying I want to demystify the use of technology in classrooms and schools, because oftentimes it is felt that, the technology, when technology comes into schools and classrooms, it will replace the teacher. And my own experience has been quite the contrary. Number one, I feel technology in our diverse classes is actually quite a leveler. So when we talk about, a differentiated approach in classes, technology is a big boon. Secondly, I found that technology actually empowers teachers and motivates them more than we could ever imagine. And once they learn a technology tool and they feel that their work is becoming more productive, their time is becoming more productive, they feel a sense of pride in the work that they're doing. So I definitely feel technology helps teachers to feel, to feel better about their work. It doesn't dehumanize education. The third thing is that it actually creates a bond between the teacher and the taught, because this is a situation where children know more than the teachers, and there's sometimes a role reversal that happens, and the bond between the teacher and taught becomes stronger. So this is something that at every forum I want to emphasize that, it's not the elephant in the room. It is something that schools and educators are increasingly understanding that they need it and they want it. So having said that, I would say that, there are many EdTech companies here, and I work with some, and I am constantly being asked to meet up with some, some startups who've got new ideas on education and technology. And I'd just like to maybe share my experience with integrating technology, and we've done that in a big way in our school, all our schools. And I would say that, number one, maybe I just want to share some tips with people who are looking at technology in classrooms and in schools. Number one, that the future of education is definitely in personalized learning. So, in Twitter language, personalization is trending. Digitization, personalization, and I hear these words like machine learning and artificial intelligence and NLP and all that. Now, all this is going to be the future. But having said that, I would say that pedagogy and adapting pedagogy and technology together, they have to be aligned to each other. So we have to change pedagogy, integrating technology into it, and technology has to keep in mind what is the existing pedagogy. So what is the problem that we are trying to address? Are we answering that problem? So if these could go hand in hand, and if, so then we will see some positive outcomes. Number two, so what I found is going further, I think it is at the intersection of technology and teachers and ideas and entrepreneurs where innovation is going to happen in schools. What has happened, and that's my sense, that there are lots of EdTech companies which are, imagining that this is the problem in the classroom, and they're finding solutions. But maybe they will not work in the school because they are working in isolation of educators who are working on the ground. So I think as an EdTech company, it's important to work closely with schools and educators and see what is the actual pain point and are we addressing that. Because sometimes I find that working in ivory towers, you come up with solutions which don't work on the ground. And this has happened with many, many brilliant ideas which look very fancy and we feel that this will work, but you take it into the classroom, the children don't want it, the teachers don't want it. So integrating and taking feedback from teachers, and I think that's this whole process of, ideating, prototyping, and repeated iteration that will work with tech in schools and classrooms. And the next thing is that technology needs to be simple for teachers to adopt it. It needs, it could be maybe a single sign-on and they should be able to do it. And that's something, for example, in our school, we've used, the flipped approach. And what has happened is, we've looked at tools which are easy, customizable, which teachers are, don't find it difficult to understand, and they need hand-holding. I think what Prachi said earlier, I cannot emphasize it more that teachers, it's not just a product which we give to the teachers and say go and use it. They need to be inducted into it. So I think teacher training on the product is extremely important. So the technology has to be not just student-centric, and we're looking at the student as the end user, but who is going to deliver that to the child? It's the teacher. So we have to also make it teacher-centric. Okay, so and the fourth thing is that it has to be beyond a learning management system or an ERP solution which works in maybe some other industries. But in schools, it's a different, in education, it's a different ballgame. So can we have something which is going to make the work of a teacher easier? So it could be in terms of maybe integrating collaborative tools, productive tools, some social tools, assessments, analytics, all of that content which comes in an interactive format. So I think that's something that we're looking at. And the final thing is that there are so many players in the market. I hear of so many companies which are in the content space, then there are so many in the delivery space. So what happens as a school, we get confused. So maybe we need to have an organized market where not just many small players, but maybe somebody who represents that space, and schools would then be more receptive. So.
Right there's an interesting opportunity for an IT consultant in the market. Karthik, let me switch to you. We're running out of time because we were already in a slightly shortened session. Higher education, regulation is difficult. You've set up a very successful online company.
Sure. So I'll actually take a leaf from whatever the panel has been discussing, and that is that if you try to sell something to the institute, then the institute starts looking at you as competition in some format. And I actually heard this in one panel about 3-4 years back when the discussion was on RTE. And is that competition, or is that going to help any entrepreneurs to work along with the institute? So if we consider them as partners, then we can see business. And that's what we have done. I will actually talk about regulation. I'll talk about the problem statement. But let me actually go back and give certain numbers, and I'm sure many of you know the numbers, but just so that I put it in perspective, India's gross education enrollment ratio in higher education is at about 20-22%. The world average is about 50%. The evolved countries are at about 80%. So you can see the difference. So we are currently at 20%. The government says we need to go to about 30%, which potentially means we need to set up another equal number of universities in the next 5 to 7 years time frame, which is impossible. So even if in case the government wants to meet its numbers that it has set for itself, it has to adopt technology. There's no way that it can set up another 500, 600 universities and that many number of colleges. So there's no issue, there's nothing that we can do about it. That's one. Second is, even if you take the 22% who are getting into higher education, but for the, so within this 600-700 universities that we have, there are 33,000 colleges. It's just about 500 colleges that are worth naming because the rest of them give very bad quality education. So even in that, if we have to give good quality education, we need to have good quality faculty, and we have limited faculty. How can you reach top-notch quality education from limited faculty to the vast expanse of colleges that we have in this country? You need to take education, EdTech platforms to enable this to happen. Now, does this take place? It happens. It has happened in the West for different reasons, but here we can do it for managing this quality itself. So I'll take a parallel of another industry. If I take Flipkart as an example, Flipkart is, according to me, is not just an online retail company. 10 years back, if I had to go shopping for a mobile, I would have to park somewhere, go shop, don't like it, take the car, go park my car, go shop. So basically what Flipkart has done, it has taken away bad shopping experience, got an element of online, and made a happy retailing shopping experience. So if in case we work with university, which is what Avagmah does, and we don't compete with them, we go them and say, we help you make money, get in more students, and help you deliver that and get quality education, then they are actually ready to do it. In the process, they look at us as money, we look at the whole process as giving quality education itself. So then comes to the question as to, does people actually do education learn through the internet? Do they actually learn through the mobile itself? They do. It's happened in our case. We're just 2 years old. We have about 3,500 paid students. And you'd be surprised to know some of the statistics that we have. 30% of the students enrolled in the last cohort undergoing distance education have a pre-enrollment salary of 10 lakh rupees, which talks a lot about the interest in this kind of education if it is quality. Otherwise, typically when you talk distance education, you typically think those are guys who not, I mean, I wouldn't recruit them. But these are good quality guys. I mean, PGPX in IIM Calcutta has a pre-enrollment salary of these levels. I'm not saying that the education that we get from the universities through the universities are of the same level, but then that's the kind of interest that gets generated. These students get up at 9 o'clock in the night and go through an online case study discussion. So where we come from is, if we create an app which is Uberish, the reason why we are so gung-ho about Uber is because it's so intuitive. So if in case we have a product which is very intuitive, which just reminds me to do things and doesn't intrude on my life, then of course EdTech is it will sell, and it is selling in our case, of course.
I think in general, we're all agreed that as you look at the education scenario, you can't look at this as e-commerce, just throw it online and magically everybody will come. There's a significant change management problem. You have to identify and understand regulation. You have to understand that this is multiple stakeholders. It has a massive impact on people's lives. If I didn't buy on Flipkart, nothing happened to me. But what I learn, who recognizes what I learn, what job I will get or what college I will get into, these are really, really important life decisions. Therefore, because they're high-risk decisions, people are more conservative about jumping to something randomly new. We have to recognize that. We have to work with those constraints. We have to work with regulation. Regulation exists for a reason as well. Let's be real. We've heard enough scams in colleges, in private schools, private colleges, government schools, whatever the case may be. And you have to take that as a given. It's true everywhere in the world. Yet, interesting models are possible. We are on the cusp of disruption. We're already seeing the disruption. How people prepare for tests now has already changed. How people get coached has already changed. The MOOCs are already in place and are accessible to us. You don't have to create a new MOOC in India. The MOOCs are already here. But if you look at models like Andela attacking Nigeria while we're sitting here talking about India, they're an incredibly successful company that has collapsed learning, employability, and put together a very interesting business model. So innovation, recognizing the real need, not just trying to say I'll just replace the teacher because I put up a better adaptive curriculum. I think, and recognizing regulation, the reality is critical in this scenario. We're actually quite positive about what's going on in education here and beyond. Thank you.